What would it look like if we never documented anything and we had no regulations, no policies, and nothing we ever followed? Probably be a little chaotic. That's my thought anyway. It'd be a little bit chaotic. That's not good. We've got to have some documents. We've got to have something written down. We've got to have some sort of policies that we follow, some sort of, understanding of what people within our organization can do, not do. We got to write that stuff down. That's going to be our security documentation. The value of that is obviously if we don't have it, we can create some chaos. If we do have it, we have a framework built. We've talked about frameworks quite a bit already. Our security documentation, our policies, our procedures, our standards, our guidelines, our baselines, all that stuff creates a roadmap towards our overall governance. So our documentation falls under governance. All of these things are kind of together, right? GRC, governance, risk management, and compliance. And we build that roadmap or that path we're going to follow to abide by the legal frameworks, the industry practices, the state and federal regulations that we're going to need to follow. We abide by that stuff by creating security documentation, building that roadmap. So let's look at our different types of documentation. And there are 5, right? 5. There are 5 on here. I was like, wait, there's 5. All right. So there's 5 types of documentation that you need to know about. There's policies, procedures, standards, baselines, and guidelines. Okay. And we're going to talk about each one. You need to know that you need to know all 5, and you need to be able to know the basic definition of each of the 5, and you need to be able to compare and contrast between them. So if I had a scenario-based question and I'm asking you about a document that is mandatory and provides a high-level strategic view of management intentions, you should know that that is policies. Okay, you should know that's policies. And that's basically what we're trying to get at. This is a good section to put together some flashcards on and kind of memorize how these things fall in. So let's talk about our policies first. So policies are one of our documents or security documentation that we have. It's one type. It is mandatory. And I have three types of documentation that is mandatory. And what mandatory means is if I write it, it must be followed. Right? If I write it, it must be followed. Doesn't mean I have to write it. Okay, so don't confuse that. I don't have to make policies necessarily. There are some clients' requirements that are going to require me to make policies. But if I do write a policy about something, then it must be implemented, it must be enforced, it must be followed. It is mandatory once written. And policies, procedures, and standards are all mandatory. And you'll see that as we go through each of the slides. Those are all mandatory. Guidelines and baselines are not. Okay, guidelines and baselines, we produce those to aid our organization in making good choices. But if I write these guidelines and baselines, they're not mandatory to be followed. So don't be confused by that. Policies are mandatory. Policies are at the very top. They're the highest level. They're the management's goals and intentions. They're our strategic sort of plan, where we're going, what we're getting after. And management decides at the end of the day what policies are put in place. Now, you might write the policy, but a senior manager for CISSP, senior manager of some kind, is going to sign that policy and agree to implement it, put it in place. Okay, you might be responsible for updating it, maintaining it, writing it, but a senior manager is going to sign off on it and say, yes, we're going to adopt this policy within our organization. Remember, I said there's always somebody in charge of you. Inside of a policy, we're going to have a purpose, a scope, and any compliance related words, other frameworks that we need to reference or other laws that we need to go to, whatever we might need to reference there. And the typical words we're going to find in a policy is the word must. Employees must log out of their computers at the end of the day. Employees must badge into the facility at the start of every shift, whatever it is, right? It's going to use words like must. Now, policies, all of these documents, policies, procedures, standards, guidelines, baselines, they're all updated as needed, but they need to be reviewed at least once a year. All right. Now, typically, some of these, they're not going to need massive changes every year, right? You're not necessarily going to rewrite the entire policy, but you must review it every year to ensure that it still fits with your strategic vision and your mission and your goals of your organization. So remember that. And in fact, if you never remember anything and you're trying to figure out an answer and it's like, how often do you review blah? Just pick annually. It's almost always the correct answer. Almost always. There's only a couple exceptions. But policies are definitely reviewed annually. And of course, they must be signed off by that senior manager. All right, senior management, somebody in the C-suite likely, or somebody above you has to sign off on policies. Now, policies in compared to procedures, policies are sort of the strategic overarching documents to define where we're going, what we're doing, etc. Procedures are actually telling us how we're going to accomplish a task, how to documents. That's what a procedure is. They are still mandatory. We've talked about that. And they're very specific, very detailed. They typically have a list of steps. This is how you implement multi-factor authentication on our cloud instances. Step 1, step 2, step 3, all right? Step-by-step descriptions, how to do something, all right? How to do something, still mandatory. If I write a procedural guide, it is mandatory for people to follow it. Standards are also mandatory. And that's the last of the 3 that are mandatory. So policies, procedures, and standards are all mandatory. And our standards define our technical aspects of our security program. They're going to talk about security. Maybe you must implement 802.1x security for all wireless networks that you have. That is a standard that your company has adapted. Right? It's a standard that is going to be defined within this policy. And it's going to be consistent across your organization. I don't create standards for different groups of people. All right. So think about that from a perspective of your business. I've got sales, I've got marketing, I've got HR, I've got IT, I've got security, I've got physical security, I've got, I don't know, who else do you got, right? So I've got all these different groups. A standard must apply to everyone. All right. I don't write standards for just marketing. I don't write standards for just IT. Standards apply to my business as a whole. That's probably the biggest difference there between a standard and a policy. Okay. Policies can apply to specific groups. Standards applies to my business as a whole. So it's going to be consistent across my organization. Now, those are the 3 mandatory: standards, policies, procedures. Those 3 are mandatory. Our discretionary options. We also have guidelines and we have baselines. Now, guidelines are just helpful advice, best practices, recommendations, words like should. You probably should hang your coat in the closet when you come into work and not on the back of your chair, right? We provided a closet for you to put your coats in. You should hang your coat. But if you want to hang your coat on the back of the chair, you're not violating the guideline. We're just tidying it up. We're trying to think, good guidelines. And that's probably a horrible example, but you kind of get the drift, right? It's helpful. Hey, did you know that there's a closet for you to put your coat in when you come into work? You don't have to hang it on the back of your chair. We recommend that you do that. That way all the coats are in the same place, out of the way. They're not hanging off the back of your chair, getting stumbled on, knocked over, whatever. It's a guideline. You're like, I might want to put my coat on during the day. I'm just going to keep it with me. Thanks for the tip, right? That's what a guideline is going to be. It's a recommended action. It's typically based on an industry best practice. The industry as a whole recommends we do this thing. We're going to build a guideline to support it and encourage our employees to follow that. But if they don't, I'm not going to write them up. They're not going to fire them. It's not that kind of document, right? It's just a guideline. We recommend you do this. This would help us as an organization. Baselines are also discretionary, and they're the minimum level of security that I'm trying to get to when it comes to my security specifically, right? So how I document a process, how I document a specific system use, that's typically going to be found in some sort of baseline. My baseline, for instance, maybe I've got TFTP, Trivial File Transfer Protocol. And I have a baseline that says that must be disabled on all systems, right? Except for these 2, right? Maybe I've got 2 systems that I'm going to say. I've created a baseline. So now what I am putting in, as a technician, maybe I'm installing a new server. I can look at a baseline and say, oh, okay, by default, this server, TFTP, it's going to be turned off. By default, I'm going to disable this. Unless it's an exception, right? So unless I create some exception for that. And that gets everybody kind of to that minimum same standard of level within my baseline. Now let's look at this from a business perspective. This baseline could be something like every single new employee must have a background check. All right. Maybe I define that background check very specifically in the language of the background check that I want, what type of background check, even. That's creating a baseline. Every new hire must have a background check conducted within, before hiring or upon hiring or during onboarding or within 30 days or whatever the case may be. I can define that in my baseline. Okay. So it could be systems, it could be people, but it's a minimum level of security. I can exceed it, I can go higher, but it's the absolute minimum that I need to achieve.